David Letterman risked everything to tell this story. Tonight, you'll understand why David Letterman leaned back slightly in his chair, smiling in that familiar, effortless way that made millions feel like he was talking just to them. Across from him sat President Donald Trump, a man whose presence could fill a room even before he spoke a word. The energy was unusual, different from the usual guests who came to the show. This was not an actor promoting a movie, nor a comedian ready with rehearsed jokes. This was the President of the United States, a man who had returned to the White House after years away and whose life had long been under public scrutiny. Every word, every glance, every movement carried weight. Letterman started with a light tone, his smile softening the tension in the air. "Mr. President," he said, voice calm and measured. "There's been a lot of talk about you and Ivanka lately." At first, it seemed like a simple, almost harmless question. The audience laughed lightly. Thinking it might be a playful moment, Letterman had a talent for asking questions that felt easy, like a gentle tap on the shoulder, only to reveal something deeper if the guest responded honestly. Trump's response was immediate, but not in the way anyone expected. His expression, usually confident and composed, tightened. The smile he wore before faded into a sharper line. Instead of brushing off the comment with humor, he leaned in, and his voice carried a new edge. "What do you mean talk about my daughter?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was a challenge. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish. In an instant, the audience, initially relaxed, went quiet, laughter died in the air. Letterman, who was used to handling strong personalities, noticed a shift immediately. Trump's tone became personal. He wasn't just defending his daughter. He was attacking. "You've been bitter ever since your ratings dropped," Trump said, a sneer visible in his voice. "You don't matter anymore. People don't care what you think." There was a deliberate sharpness in his words, as if he were testing the host, daring him to respond. Letterman's smile faltered. For the first time in the evening, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The audience could sense it. This was not a playful exchange. Something heavier was at stake. The room, once light with anticipation, felt tense, almost fragile. People leaned forward in their seats, aware that they were watching something more than a routine interview. It was a confrontation, subtle at first, but rising fast. And yet, Letterman didn't panic. He had faced difficult guests before, but there was something different about Trump. He didn't just argue. He tried to dominate the conversation. He controlled the pace, choosing when to speak, what to answer, and how long to stay on a topic. His presence was like a tide, pushing forward with force, leaving little room for opposition. But Letterman had a plan, or at least an instinct, for handling moments like this. He waited. He listened. He let Trump speak. Trump continued speaking, in his familiar rhythm, the kind that sweeps listeners along with long sentences and bold statements. He moved from topic to topic, from business success to family loyalty, often ignoring the original question entirely. He laughed at some points, paused dramatically at others, and occasionally threw in a jab, reminding the audience and Letterman of his power. Each comment seemed carefully calculated, like a chess move designed to keep the host on the defensive. Letterman, however, did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer than usual, letting the audience feel the tension, letting Trump feel the lack of control. Then, with his calm voice, he leaned slightly forward and spoke again. His tone was gentle, almost conversational, but the words carried weight. "You want to talk about ratings?" he said, carefully choosing each word. "Let's talk about the truth." The audience felt it immediately. That simple line changed in the air in the studio. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it held authority. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. Trump, used to guiding conversations, felt a subtle but unmistakable challenge. Letterman was no longer just asking questions. He was guiding the discussion, reminding everyone, including the president, that he controlled the flow. Trump's expression flickered. He was momentarily thrown off guard. His confidence remained, but there was a hint of calculation behind his eyes, a recognition that this would not be an ordinary interview. Letterman's calm persistence, the deliberate way he framed the conversation, created tension without aggression. It was a quiet kind of confrontation, and it drew the audience in even more. For the viewers, it was captivating. The usual structure of a talk show, question, answer, laugh, had vanished. What remained was a battle of presence, intellect, and control. Trump tried to navigate it, leaning on charm, humor, and deflection. Letterman, however, stayed steady, letting each moment build, letting each word count. The room, though silent at times, was alive with anticipation. Every phrase, every pause, seemed to matter more than usual. As the interview continued, it became clear that this would be remembered. Not for jokes or light banter, but for the tension, the control, and the way Letterman had responded to a guest used to dominating any room he entered. That opening exchange set the tone for the entire conversation. Trump might have tried to steer the night from the start, but Letterman had flipped the rules. He had turned a simple question about Ivanka into a test of control, focus, and calm authority. And in that quiet, charged studio, the audience and everyone watching knew something important was happening. This was not just another talk show segment. It was a masterclass in handling power, tension, and high-stakes conversation unfolding in real time before their eyes. After the tense opening, the room felt charged like the calm before a storm. Trump, still trying to regain control, leaned back slightly, his usual confidence present, but with a hint of caution. He had expected an easy start, a few soft questions, maybe some laughs. Instead, the first volley had already unsettled him. Letterman, on the other hand, was quiet, watching and listening, knowing exactly when to strike. Then he struck without warning. Letterman pulled out his phone. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but the audience sensed the weight behind it. On the small screen, a clip began to play. An old interview where Trump had spoken about Ivanka in a way that had once been dismissed as a joke. The room went silent as Trump's words filled the air, his tone from years ago, now landing in an entirely different light. Letterman didn't interrupt. He let the clip play all the way through, his eyes calm, his expression unreadable. When it ended, he looked directly into the camera and spoke softly, almost like a whisper. What if it wasn't a joke? The room held its breath. The question was simple, yet it cut through the pretense, demanding attention. Trump shifted in his seat, trying to mask surprise with a small, quick smile. He attempted to laugh it off, making a joke about the clip being old news, but the words fell flat. Letterman's question hung in the air. There was no escaping it. The audience felt the tension, and even the usually boisterous crowd remained quiet, sensing that something serious was happening. Then Letterman revealed the first piece of real shock. He said he had received an anonymous package containing hospital records. The papers listed Ivanka Trump as the mother of a child born when she was 23 and Donald Trump as the father. The weight of the revelation hit the room immediately. A collective gasp rose from the audience. The silence was louder than any shout. Trump's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he looked as if he had lost a small piece of the battle for control. Letterman remained composed. He let the moment sink in. He didn't shout or make dramatic claims. Instead, he spoke quietly, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The records weren't just allegations. They were documents, official in appearance, tangible, and specific. The audience leaned in, captivated, feeling as if the room had become something much more than a talk show stage. Then came another twist. Letterman began to play clips from behind the scenes of Trump's old show appearances. In one particular moment, Trump was caught whispering off mic, saying, "She's mine in every way." It was brief, almost easy to miss, but Letterman highlighted it. He connected it to Ivanka's 9-month European modeling break years earlier, suggesting the timing matched a potential pregnancy. The audience reacted with quiet shock. Whispers spread through the studio. People realized the story was not only unexpected, but deeply complicated. This wasn't about gossip anymore. It was about unraveling a series of hidden connections, long concealed from the public eye. Letterman was laying out a puzzle piece by piece, and everyone was watching, unable to look away. Trump's reactions became more visible. He leaned forward, trying to regain the narrative. He attempted to joke again, suggesting the questions were unfair or absurd. But the calm authority of Letterman made those attempts seem weak. Each time Trump tried to redirect or deflect, Letterman responded, not with anger, but with subtle persistence, asking questions that forced him to confront the implications without ever raising his voice. Then the first human witness appeared. A former Trump Organization staffer stepped forward, revealing that they had delivered prenatal vitamins to Ivanka's apartment under Trump's direct orders. The revelation was small in words, but enormous in impact. It suggested premeditation, planning, and knowledge, elements that added credibility to Letterman's growing narrative. The audience's reactions were a mix of disbelief and fascination. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Letterman continued, connecting dots with precision. He explained how Ivanka's modeling break, the timing of the records, and the off-mic comment all aligned. He painted a timeline quietly, patiently, letting the audience, and even Trump, absorb each detail. The calmness of his delivery contrasted sharply with the shocking content, making it even more gripping. Trump's attempts to regain control started to crack. He was used to speaking freely, dominating a conversation with confidence and volume. But here, in this moment, Letterman had created a new kind of power. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was steady, patient, and undeniable. Trump tried to smile, tried to joke, tried to assert authority, but the calm weight of evidence was working against him. As the segment continued, Letterman hinted at deeper layers. He suggested that the audience was seeing only the surface. There were connections, patterns, and details that were not obvious at first glance. By carefully arranging each revelation, the clip, the records, the staffer's testimony, he was building something bigger than a story. He was building a case in real time, and the tension was electric. By the end of this part of the interview, the audience realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Trump, for all his experience in public appearances and interviews, was facing questions he couldn't easily control. Letterman, with quiet authority, had shifted the balance of power. The friendly talk of the start was gone. What remained was a high-stakes confrontation driven not by shouting or spectacle, but by calm, precise questioning and carefully presented evidence. The first shock had landed. The room, once light and playful, now held a weight that was impossible to ignore. Every eye in the audience, every ear tuned in, understood that this interview had changed. The story was no longer just about a president and his daughter. It had become something much bigger. A challenge to control, a battle of presence and persistence, and a careful unfolding revelation that demanded attention. And at that moment, the audience, along with everyone watching, realized that the rest of the night would not be ordinary. The room felt heavier now, as if every word hung in the air and demanded attention. Letterman had shifted the interview from casual conversation to something more intense. Trump, who had walked in with confidence and a sense of control, now seemed on edge. His attempts to steer the conversation were met with calm persistence, and the audience could sense that the balance had tipped. This was no longer a simple exchange about ratings or family. This was a careful unraveling of secrets, one piece at a time, and Letterman was holding the pen. Letterman continued methodically. He began connecting dots, showing the audience that what seemed isolated before, the old clip, the hospital records, the staffer's testimony, were part of a larger story. He spoke slowly, letting the weight of each detail sink in. The audience leaned forward, caught in the unfolding narrative, unable to turn away. The quiet intensity of his voice made the revelations feel sharper, the connections harder to ignore. Then came a new voice in the room. A former Trump Organization staffer stepped forward, sharing what they had witnessed years ago. Under direct orders from Trump, they had delivered prenatal vitamins to Ivanka's apartment. The statement was small in words, but monumental in implications. It suggested knowledge and involvement, and the audience understood the significance. Immediately, the timing of Ivanka's 9-month European modeling trip, previously dismissed as ordinary, now took on new meaning. Letterman allowed the audience to draw their own connections, never forcing them, but laying out a timeline with precision. Trump's reactions grew more visible. He shifted in his chair, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He tried to joke about the staffer's testimony, dismissing it as a small detail or irrelevant. But the calm authority of Letterman left little room for deflection. Every attempt to steer the conversation back into familiar territory was blocked. Not with confrontation, but with focused questions and evidence that spoke louder than any argument could. Letterman then introduced another piece of the puzzle. It brought forward Ivanka's former assistant, who admitted, after a long pause, and with visible hesitation, that she had signed papers, agreeing never to speak about family matters tied to Barron's birth. The audience reacted audibly. The admission added weight to what had already been suggested by the records and the staffer's testimony. Here was someone who had been part of the inner circle, bound by secrecy, now speaking even partially to the story that Letterman was piecing together. Every new detail Letterman presented reinforced the emerging picture: Ivanka's modeling break, the timing of the hospital records, the staffer's actions, and the assistant admissions, all fit together in a way that was difficult to dismiss. Letterman painted a timeline and deliberate, connecting events that had once seemed disconnected. He didn't need to shout or make accusations. The narrative itself carried the impact. The audience could see the story forming like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place, revealing an image they had never expected. Trump tried again, attempting to laugh off the claims, insisting that these were rumors, exaggerations, or irrelevant distractions. He spoke quickly, almost as if by talking faster, he could regain control, but Letterman didn't flinch. He allowed the evidence and testimony to speak, returning to the facts, connecting one detail to the next with clarity and precision. The calmness of his delivery contrasted sharply with the chaos in Trump's attempts to dominate the narrative, making the story even more compelling. Letterman's strategy was subtle but effective. He wasn't attacking. He was laying out evidence, guiding the audience through each detail, letting the truth emerge on its own. And as the pieces fell into place, the audience could see the emerging picture: a hidden pregnancy, carefully concealed, orchestrated secrecy, and a story of family matters that had been kept from public view. The implications were immense. and the tension in the room was palpable. At this point, Trump's frustration became visible. He leaned forward, his voice rising slightly, attempting to regain control with a mix of humor and indignation. But every move he made was met with calm persistence. Letterman didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply presented the next piece, letting the evidence do the work. It was a master class in handling a powerful personality. The host maintained control, not by force, but by focus and timing. Letterman then began to connect the timing of events with personal actions. He highlighted Ivanka's European modeling trip, the months that coincided with the supposed pregnancy, and the preparation that must have gone into keeping it a secret. He carefully explained how the records, the staffer's testimony, and the assistant admissions all aligned with this timeline. The story, once scattered and confusing, now started to make sense in a way that was impossible to ignore. The audience was silent for long stretches, absorbing each revelation, feeling the weight of the story as it unfolded. There were no dramatic sound effects, no shouting matches. The drama came from the careful accumulation of facts. The way each new piece built upon the last, Letterman's.com persistence created suspense, drawing the audience into a web of intrigue that felt immediate and personal. By the end of this part of the interview, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Letterman had shown that what once seemed like disconnected rumors or coincidences could now be seen as part of a larger, coherent narrative. Trump's attempts to dominate or control the conversation had failed. He was now reacting, adjusting, and trying to regain footing in a discussion that had moved beyond his control. For the audience, the impact was clear. The story was no longer about ratings, jokes, or offhand remarks. It was about hidden truths, carefully guarded secrets, and the power of calm persistence to bring clarity to complex situations. Letterman had pieced together a puzzle that revealed more than anyone expected, and in doing so, he had demonstrated that even the most powerful figures could be challenged. Not with aggression, but with careful, methodical questioning and the courage to let the truth emerge. The tension in the room had reached a point where it felt almost tangible. Letterman had already shown clips, presented testimonies, and connected long-hidden pieces of information, but he wasn't finished. What came next would turn the entire narrative from speculation into something that could not easily be ignored. This was the moment when the story became concrete, when quiet implications became visible evidence. Letterman leaned forward and began to reveal a series of files from a Swiss clinic. They were meticulous, fishy-looking documents that detailed medical information about Ivanka Trump under another name. Every entry matched dates and events that aligned with Barron's birth. The details were precise. Dates, appointments, even test results that suggested a pregnancy had occurred at a time no one had expected. For the audience, the revelation was almost impossible to ignore. The connection between Ivanka's secret of months in Europe, her absence from public events, and the records in this foreign clinic created a chain that was hard to dismiss. Trump's reaction was immediate. His smile vanished, replaced with a tense expression. He attempted to speak to dismiss the documents as irrelevant or fabricated, but Letterman did not pause or react to the interruption. The calm persistence in Letterman's tone, the way he laid out each piece of evidence, made Trump's attempts to control the conversation seem futile. Every time Trump tried to brush it off, Letterman presented another fact, another connection, another piece of proof that kept the audience leaning forward. The next revelation came from Ivanka's former assistant. She admitted hesitantly that she had signed agreements to never speak publicly about certain family matters connected to Barron's birth. The weight of that statement was enormous. Letterman carefully explained how these agreements, combined with the clinic records and previous testimonies, built a timeline that suggested a deliberate attempt to conceal the pregnancy. For the first time, the audience could see the story forming as a coherent narrative rather than scattered rumors. Letterman then highlighted a moment from behind the scenes of Trump's past appearances. In one video, Trump was caught whispering, off mic, saying, "She's mine, in every way." The phrase was brief, easy to miss, but in the context of the new evidence, it took on an entirely different meaning. Letterman connected this to Ivanka's 9-month modeling break in Europe and the timeline of Barron's birth. Every detail reinforced the idea that there was a story being hidden from the public and that it had been carefully orchestrated. Trump's attempts to regain control became more visible and more aggressive. He raised his voice, insisting that Letterman was obsessed with my beautiful daughter and claiming the evidence was fabricated. He tried to steer the conversation back to general topics, to deflect attention away from the growing chain of proof. But Letterman remained composed. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, and he didn't let the conversation slip away. Instead, he calmly connected one piece of evidence to the next, showing the audience how it all fit together in a clear, undeniable sequence. Then came the final layer of evidence. Letterman revealed more documents from the Swiss clinic, records that included appointments, medical notes, and identification details, matching the timeline and medical circumstances of Barron's birth. Each document reinforced the story, showing that Ivanka had registered under a different name, that medical records had been meticulously kept, and that the timing corresponded precisely with the periods when she had been away from the public eye. The audience gasped repeatedly as Letterman laid out these connections. Understanding the depth and complexity of what was being revealed, the most dramatic moment came when Letterman calmly summarized the implications. He outlined the timeline, Ivanka's secret of months abroad, the medical records showing a hidden pregnancy, the staffer's testimony about prenatal vitamins, the assistant signed agreements, and Trump's off-mic comments. Each piece independently was notable, but together they formed a story that was almost impossible to ignore. Letterman's final words in this section were simple, measured, but devastating. The pieces are here. The question is not if, but why this was hidden from the public. Trump's frustration became impossible to hide. His attempts to control the room grew desperate. He repeated that the documents were false, that the stories were lies, and that Letterman was a washed-up host trying to stay relevant. But the calm presentation of evidence had already shifted the perception. It was no longer a matter of opinion or rumor. The audience and anyone watching could see a clear, structured pattern emerge. Letterman ended the segment with a quiet but powerful line. If this is all a lie, then show the truth. He didn't shout it. He didn't demand answers, but the weight of the statement hung over the room. It was a challenge, a demand for accountability, and a signal that the conversation had moved far beyond the usual questions and answers of a television interview. By the end of this section, the evidence had done its work. The room was no longer casual, no longer playful. The audience understood the gravity of what had been revealed, and Trump had been forced into a reactive position. Letterman had flipped the script completely. He had turned an interview that Trump had hoped to control into a presentation of carefully organized facts and testimonies that raised serious questions, ones that could not be ignored or laughed away. In that moment, the narrative had shifted. Letterman's.com. Methodical approach had demonstrated that the power of evidence and patience could outweigh the force of personality. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to dominate. Yet, the effect was absolute. The audience could see the story taking shape. And even Trump, for all his experience and confidence, had been forced to confront the challenge. The evidence revealed in this part of the interview wasn't just shocking. It was undeniable in its structure, meticulous in its presentation, and compelling in its implications. For viewers, the lesson was clear. Truth has a way of asserting itself when it is patiently, methodically, and carefully presented. And in this quiet, intense display, Letterman had shown exactly how that could be done, step by step, fact by fact, until the story could no longer be ignored. The broadcast ended, but the tension lingered, thick and almost palpable. The studio lights had dimmed, the cameras had stopped rolling, and yet the impact of what had unfolded remained in every mind. Letterman had done something no one had expected. What started as a routine interview had transformed into a carefully constructed presentation of evidence, questions, and revelations that challenged not just the narrative Trump had tried to control, but the very public story of his family. Trump sat in silence for a moment after the taping. Visibly frustrated, he had entered the studio expecting to guide the conversation, to dominate the room, as he often did. And yet, he had been forced into a reactive position. Every attempt to joke, deflect, or assert control had been countered with calm, deliberate evidence. The tables had turned in a way that even the most seasoned public figures rarely experienced. For Trump, who had built his life on being the one in charge, this shift was not subtle. It was a challenge. Within hours, the public reaction began to ripple. People discussed the interview, not just for its boldness, but for the way Letterman had structured it. The calm persistence, the careful layering of evidence, and the subtle but undeniable way the narrative had been revealed made it impossible to dismiss. Trump responded predictably, calling Letterman a washed-up host and insisting that the allegations were lies. He threatened legal action, vowing to sue anyone spreading false claims. Yet, the carefully presented documents, testimonies, and clips had already planted doubt in the minds of viewers. The clash between public perception and private assertion created a storm that no forceful claim could easily contain. Letterman, however, remained steady. He didn't react to threats. He didn't escalate tensions, and he didn't add fuel to the fire. Instead, he allowed the evidence to stand on its own. The calm authority with which he had delivered the narrative became the lasting impression. People remembered not the confrontations, but the way he had pieced together a puzzle in front of their eyes. His method had been precise, almost surgical, yet compelling in its storytelling power. As the days passed, details from the interview continued to surface. Analysts, commentators, and curious viewers began examining the timeline Letterman had outlined. Ivanka's European modeling break, the staffer's testimony about prenatal vitamins, the assistant's sworn silence, the clinic records, all aligning in ways that were hard to dismiss. Even those who had initially taken Trump's dismissals at face value started questioning whether the pieces fit together more convincingly than anyone had imagined. Letterman's calm/methodical approach had created a ripple effect that spread far beyond the studio. Trump, feeling the pressure, attempted damage control. Public statements, interviews, and social media posts tried to reassert control. But the more he spoke, the more his narrative seemed reactive. He was no longer setting the pace. He was responding to the structure Letterman had created. Every claim of falsehood, every insistence that the story was a lie played into the careful structure Letterman had established, making the audience compare what was said with what had been documented on air. The perception of authority had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Meanwhile, Letterman's calm, unshakable demeanor became a model for handling high-stakes situations. His approach demonstrated that influence doesn't always come from aggression or volume. It can come from patience, careful preparation, and the courage to present uncomfortable truths without theatrics. The audience, both in the studio and watching at home, could see that an interview, when conducted with focus and persistence, could uncover information that would otherwise remain hidden. As the story circulated, questions began to emerge. Viewers debated the timeline of Ivanka's modeling break, the clinic records, and the staffer's statements. Some asked whether there were more undisclosed details behind the scenes. Others speculated on how public perception might change if the evidence was examined more closely. Letterman had not only challenged Trump's control in that moment, he had sparked a broader discussion about accountability, transparency, and the power of calm, persistent questioning. Trump's public image, built over decades on confidence, control, and charisma, faced an unexpected test. The interview highlighted how even the most commanding personalities could be confronted when facts were presented clearly and methodically. His threats of lawsuits and accusations of obsession seemed to emphasize his reaction rather than weaken Letterman's narrative. The contrast between Trump's fiery responses and Letterman's calm authority became a defining element of the aftermath. For Letterman, the interview was a statement about the power of preparation and focus. He had not needed to shout, raise his voice, or dominate the conversation with force. Each piece of evidence, each question, and each carefully connected timeline spoke louder than confrontation ever could. The interview became a demonstration of how thoughtful, persistent storytelling could change the perception of power in real time. In the days and weeks that followed, the public continued to process what had happened. The interview wasn't just a television moment. It was a case study in influence, control, and accountability. Letterman had revealed that control is not about who talks the loudest or fastest, but about who presents the truth clearly and calmly. Even Trump, for all his experience, had been forced to confront evidence he could not simply ignore or spin. Ultimately, the aftermath of the interview underscored a lesson in human behavior and communication. Power can be challenged even in high-stakes situations when patience, evidence, and clarity are employed strategically. The story of the night became a lasting example of how careful, methodical questioning could uncover hidden truths, challenge authority, and create a narrative that resonated far beyond the immediate moment. By the time the conversation faded from immediate memory, the impact remained. Letterman had shifted the dynamic entirely, leaving a mark on viewers and participants alike. The room may have emptied, the cameras may have stopped, and the broadcast may have ended, but the lessons of that night about courage, calmness, and the power of evidence would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it, shaping how such moments would be remembered for years, too.